You're listening to the BBC World Service. I'm Julian Marshall, and this is News Hour. Daniel Kibret is an influential advisor to Ethiopia's Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, and earlier this month he made a speech in the country's Amhara region, which has been widely shared on social media and has attracted a lot of adverse attention. Deacon Kibret was addressing a meeting to raise funds for Amhara militias fighting alongside federal forces in their ongoing war with the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front, or TPLF. And the TPLF has accused him of inciting genocide against ethnic Tigrayans in that speech. The BBC's Amharic service translated some of what he said for us.
These people, and those who are similar to these people, should be the last of their kind. We should prevent people like them coming into being by all means. People like them should not be born again in this country. We need to not only erase them from the physical place, but also from the human mind. They should be erased from the human soul and history records as well.
But this week, a US State Department spokesman said that hateful rhetoric like this is dangerous and unacceptable, and that Washington was concerned about bellicose rhetoric on all sides in the conflict. Well, it's a grave allegation, this, against a senior government figure. Is it incitement to genocide? Is it hate speech? If either, against who, and what needs to happen? Ethiopian-born Dr. Awol Allo is a senior lecturer in law at Keele University in the UK.
The language he was using was generic. He was saying they and them. So he's very clearly referring at least to TPLF or forces that are associated with Tigray Defense Forces. So at the minimum, he is referring to them. Even if that was to be the case, the kind of language that he used, a very direct, very public, very clear language that is not equivocal at all, calling for their destruction, calling for the erasure, not just from the historical record, from people's consciousness. That is a very dangerous rhetoric, and that, according to Ethiopian law, is incitement to genocide. In Ethiopia, the law protects not just national, ethnic, racial, religious groups from genocide, but also political groups. In 2006, we have a situation where the former president of Ethiopia and several leaders who was part of the Derg regime were convicted for genocide by Ethiopian court. So it's astonishing that both the Prime Minister and the Attorney General have absolutely nothing to say when somebody in position of influence, like Daniel Kibret, has used that kind of very incendiary language.
I mean, the fact that Daniel Kibret has subsequently told the French news agency AFP that he was only speaking about the TPLF, does that make any difference?
You know, in the Ethiopian context, the line between a political group and ethnic group is very, very narrow, precisely because today the largest majority of Tigrayans support the Tigray regional government that is led by the Tigray People's Liberation Front. Since this war started, there is an increasing conflation of fighters and civilians on the one hand, but also political organizations and the civilian category on whose behalf those political organizations speak. So the language that he used in this case might suggest that he is referring to only to TPLF, but there is such an increasing conflation that his audience, the people to whom he is addressing that speech, are highly likely to understand him as basically saying anyone who supports that movement. But regardless of who he is referring to, he himself has accepted that he is referring to TPLF. If that is the case, the language that he used very clearly is an incitement to an act of genocide under Ethiopian law. When the entire government basically denies that what he said amounts to that, I think you can see that that essentially amounts to endorsement.
I mean, you say that incitement to genocide is a criminal offence in Ethiopia, but correct me if I'm wrong, isn't there an exception for criticism directed against political opponents? Might he not argue that this speech fell into that category?
Calling for the destruction, for the erasure of a political group is not a criticism. The law obviously protects a wider scope of freedom of expression, but a very direct language that specifically targets a single political group, calls for their destruction, refers to them as a weed that the Ethiopian state, the land, should no longer sustain, that they should be raised from the institutional registers, from public records, from the conscience of human beings. That is not a protected speech. That's incitement to genocide under Ethiopian law.
The Ethiopian government has declined to talk to us about this, although they have said that the speech has been mistranslated and taken out of context. But you would disagree?
Well, I am a native Amharic speaker. There is really nothing ambiguous about that language. There's nothing mistranslated. It's very clear that I think independent organizations, including media organizations, can seek independent translation. The language is very clear.
The Ethiopian Human Rights Commission sent a statement in which they urge all people to avoid dehumanizing and inflammatory language, even in situations where legal loopholes might allow getting away with certain things. You don't expect, therefore, Daniel Kibret to be disciplined or taken to court in any way?
Of course, this is not a language that is used for the first time. The Prime Minister himself referred to the same forces as weeds, as cancer. There are other individuals of influence within the government that use more or less similar languages. So Daniel is right in the sense that there is an increasing use of dehumanizing and incendiary language. But I think at the same time, I have not, for example, heard similar language used by TDF forces, and I think if the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission has evidence, it's important that they come forward. The Tigrayans refer to the Ethiopian government side in most cases as fascists, but I have not heard a similar language from that side.
I mean, the US State Department said recently that it will undertake a fact and law review to seek clarification of whether atrocities committed in Tigray are war crimes, crimes against humanity, or genocide. Should this kind of speech, in your view, be part of that investigation?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think this is very much at the forefront of evidence that exists in the public domain that very clearly indicates that perhaps those atrocities that have actually been committed may have been driven by this kind of motive.
So what's the way out of this? At the very least, do you believe that Abiy Ahmed should distance himself from Daniel Kibret?
So the problem is not just him. In fact, what he did is extremely egregious, and I think he should be held accountable, and the government should remove him from his position. Otherwise, I think that amounts to the government as a whole endorsing his speech. But I think the problem is far wider. It's important that the international community finds a way to pressure the Ethiopian government to end the war and to end the atrocities. Without that, I think, if the international community is simply to watch what is unfolding in Ethiopia, maybe we're looking at the Rwanda moment once again. In Rwanda in 1994, the international community, someone said we did not really know what was going on. That was 1994. Today, 2021, I don't think the international community can say that they didn't know what was going on in Ethiopia. The evidence is out there.
That was Dr. Awol Allo, a senior lecturer in law at Kiel University. Well, as I said earlier, the Ethiopian government has declined to grant us an interview, but they have sent us this statement, and I quote, "There continues to be a gross misreading of statements issued by various federal government entities without understanding the nuances of Ethiopian language. TPLF sympathizer translations cannot be the basis of declaring statements as hateful rhetoric. The government of Ethiopia remains committed to thwarting the threat of terrorist organizations like the TPLF while working to protect Ethiopians in the Tigray region." You're listening to News Hour.